The Child and Migrant Services mission is to provide and coordinate community services for migrant and settled farm workers and their families in Mesa County so that they may live and work with dignity in our community. An 1880 newspaper article describing the Western Slope appearing in the July 9th issue of the Denver Tribune wrote, "The whole country, with the exception of some small valleys along the North Fork of the Gunnison River and the Grand River, is too rugged and mountainous to possess any value for agricultural and grazing purposes. Goats and mountain sheep might find it to their taste, and no one who has seen it can begrudge its quiet possession to the Utes. For civilized man, it is apparently about as valuable as the desert of the Sahara. To parties contemplating a visit to the region, our advice would be, don't go." In spite of these dire warnings, settlers did come, drawn by the opportunity that the western frontier offered. Among the first settlers to understand the potential of agricultural development on the Western Slope was William E. Paber. In 1882, Paber purchased land in present-day Fruita, and the following year planted several different types of fruit, including apricots, pears, cherries, grapes, apples, and peaches. In spite of the region's arid nature, settlers descended on the valley convinced that opportunity awaited them. Sugar beets, apples, and peaches became the area's best-known early crops. Grand Junction's inaugural Peach Day was held in 1891 and by all accounts proved quite successful. Even at this early stage of agricultural development, the Western Slope in general, and Palisade in particular, were becoming well known for the quality of their fruit production. Peach Day, since renamed the Palisade Peach Festival, remains an enormously popular event. Farm work, by its very nature, attracts the least privileged of society. It is incredibly hard work, the hours are long, and the pay is low. Many ethnic groups served as the agricultural labor force in the valley, including the Chinese and Japanese, until they became victims of ethnic discrimination. During the war years, Colorado's labor supply included German prisoners of war, African Americans, and Native Americans. Although Mexicans had long been part of the labor force, it was not until the Mexican Revolution in 1910 that large numbers began to immigrate northward. One of the remnants of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs was the labor camp at Palisade. The 200-unit camp was erected and run as part of the Farm Security Administration program, which was established to help house the enormous number of displaced migrant workers and their families during the Great Depression. In 1948, the camp was purchased by the Palisade Peach Board of Control. Along with serving the housing needs of migrant farm workers, it also allowed organizations interested in working with the migrants a central location to work from. In 1954, the Colorado Migrant Ministry approached several Palisade churches and growers' wives to gauge the interest in forming a local chapter of migrant ministry. Among those who attended the initial meeting was Dorothy Power, Margaret Talbot, and Ruth Toothaker.
It come really from the people that first come in here were just very poor. Maybe they slept under the bridges or along the rivers or under a tree, and that's when we got this idea that we needed to help them.
Margaret Talbot was one of the founding members, and she was a firecracker. She was a real torch and had been involved from its foundation in 1954 until, probably the late 80s. And so I had the opportunity of working with her and kind of gathering her image and vision of where she wanted to take this organization.
In 1955, the Mesa County Migrant Council, a nonprofit county-wide and voluntary organization, consisted of representatives of clubs, churches, and governmental agencies. It was important that since this new organization would be receiving federal funds, that it not be a strictly religious organization, thus the inclusion of several secular entities. In time, the Mesa County Migrant Council would become known as Child and Migrant Services. The government funds now made available to the newly formed Child and Migrant Services allowed them to begin expanding the services they offered to the migrants. During 1960, a free night medical clinic was begun at the office of Dr. C.H. Bliss, who had been actively involved in migrant health care since he began practicing medicine in 1953. Prior to this, migrant health care had been provided at the labor camp, but as the program expanded, it was decided that Dr. Bliss's office, which was better supplied and equipped, was a more satisfactory setting. As a way to fund these night clinics, Dr. Bliss and the Child and Migrant Services approached the Colorado State Health Department about a new migrant Medicare program. The 1960s, particularly during the Johnson administration, saw an incredible increase in federally funded programs. Not since the Roosevelt New Deal programs of the 1930s and 40s had the country witnessed this type of federal investment in programs designed to address the needs of the underprivileged. As part of President Johnson's Great Society program, the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, or EOA, was passed, creating a Federal Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO. The Economic Opportunity Act stated in part, "It is therefore the policy of the United States to eliminate the paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty in this nation by opening to everyone the opportunity for education and training, the opportunity to work, and the opportunity to live in decency and dignity." It was during this time also that the Colorado Migrant Council, or CMC, was formed to address the problems facing migrant farm workers and their families in the state. Beginning in 1967, the Colorado Migrant Council had become the agency through which federal funds from OEO would be distributed to the Western Slope. The initial reaction was one of relief by those who had been working with the migrants for several years, particularly CMS. Finally, it was thought real work could be accomplished with these newly realized government dollars. But there would be a price to pay for federal involvement. The number of programs, and therefore the number of administrators and committees, increased dramatically. As reported in the Grand Junction Daily Sentinel, April 28, 1967, Colorado has been selected as the pilot project of an OEO-sponsored program, the nation's first attempt to look at the migrant problem as a whole. This pilot project, unquestionably begun with the best intentions, soon began to unravel. Child and Migrant Services felt in many ways, and rightfully so, that their local efforts and authority made over the years were being usurped at the state and federal level. Ultimately, as many of these federal programs lost their funding, the grassroots activism begun by CMS and the Colorado Council of Churches in 1948 would again play a key role in the development of programs designed to help the migrant farm workers and their families. In fairness, the infusion of federal dollars did not always result in failed programs. Many fine, dedicated individuals at the local and state level worked exceedingly hard during these years to help migrants. Unfortunately, in the case of the Western Slope, the result was, more often than not, bureaucratic mismanagement, resulting in inefficiently run programs and hard feelings all around. Many of these programs continued to plague CMS going into the 1970s. While strides continued to be made in education, welfare, and so on, there always seemed to be a feeling that not enough was being done, or that the existing programs were not being administered to their full potential. One of the benefits of the expanded program begun in 1967, however, was that CMS began to develop new ideas and more creative ways to carry out their programs. Their evolution as an advocacy group for migrant workers allowed their ideas to become broader in scope, and other issues such as housing were being addressed seriously for the first time. And if there was a sense of falling short on their goals during this period, it was a frustration born to the desire to accomplish more each year.